Good morning. Welcome to this week's edition of History Comes Alive. Today we're exploring the world of the Vikings, the real Vikings, not the fake Vikings. So there's a lot of myth and misunderstanding regarding the Vikings, very colorful people of Northern Europe about 1,000 years or so ago. But again, not all of what we understand today is accurate. For example, I'm going to play a little commercial here. Some of you may remember this from a few years ago. Wrong on very many levels regarding the Vikings, so I hope you enjoy this. All right, can we get the screen up there? There you go.
With Capital One Card Lab's new triple rewards, me and the lads are having a tough time deciding which category to choose. Like triple rewards on electronics. Or gas and groceries.
10 items, Bob.
Maybe triple rewards on restaurants and entertainment. Or travel.
Introducing triple rewards of your choice. Log on to Card Lab at CapitalOne.com to personalize your card.
What's in your wallet?
Well, yes, that's not an accurate representation of the Vikings, obviously, but exploited for, can we say cultural appropriation, exploited for commercial purposes. So let me point out to you on this next slide, the first point I want to make today is that the Vikings did not wear horned helmets. On the left is actually a display in a Viking museum in Sweden. I visited Viking regions, northern Germany, southern Sweden, and Denmark about 4 years ago. So that's where I had an opportunity to learn a lot about the Vikings and notice this image. Well, I added the X, but no, they did not wear horned helmets. That's mostly a fiction that persisted in German folklore and was really exploited by Richard Wagner in his Ring cycle of operas. He staged some of his characters, Germanic figures with horned helmets, and the image has persisted ever since. This is a diorama on the right from the Viking Museum in York, England, in northern England, an important center of Viking culture. And it shows a Viking, a resident of York, hawking carrots and eels in this diorama. And this reinforces the notion that for most of the time, the people that we describe as Vikings lived a settled, relatively peaceful life when they were not out raiding. And the word raiding is Viking. That's where the term Viking comes from. It means going out on a raid. So that's a much more accurate picture of Viking life for the most part. So let's answer the question first off, who were the Vikings? A composite culture, Germanic peoples living in northern Germany, Denmark, southern Sweden, and Norway. They were never part of the Roman world, mostly farmers, fishers, but beginning in the mid-800s, for about 250 years, they exploded out of their native homeland on a series of raids during the summer. And these raids, again, if you went out on a raid, you were said to be going out on a Viking in their local language. This happens to be a later depiction of Vikings from a medieval manuscript in the 12th century. But so these Vikings are headed out. By the way, they never called themselves Vikings, of course. The term was popularized beginning in the late 18th century as discoveries were made about the Viking world, and they began to be offered up as an example of romantic noble savages. Not all Vikings were axe-happy hooligans. They were really no more violent than most other early societies and had a relatively sophisticated culture, which I'll be talking about here shortly. They left behind any number of fascinating, mysterious artifacts, like this iron figurine. I don't even think we have a date on this, when this face was created. And one of the reasons why the Vikings, in a lot of respects, are still very mysterious is that they had no written language. Just short inscriptions. Well, let's say no literary language. They had inscriptions which appear on these large stones, memorial stones throughout the Viking world, 24 letters called runes. And most of them were actually originally carved on wood, but about 3,000 of these memorial stones survive, and they would have originally been painted. I'll show you an example of one later on. And there, of course, is your intrepid traveler in Sweden. And behind me, by the way, is a burial mound, or in some cases, these were, I think this one was more, because it's so tall, it was a ceremonial platform, if you will, for this Viking settlement in Sweden. By the way, so we do know what we know about the Vikings because we don't have access to anything in terms of their own literary production or written production. Is most of it's acquired either from artifacts like the one on the left or from the sagas. Some of you may know these Icelandic sagas, which were written down a couple of centuries after the Viking era, after the Icelandic peoples developed and adopted a Latin-style alphabet. Well, the key, of course, to Viking culture was building and sailing ships. This is a wonderfully preserved example of a Viking longship in a museum in Norway. The cold waters and the organic characteristics of the waters in which these ships sunk have allowed them to be preserved amazingly well. And you can see a typical Viking longship. You've got this decorative prow. They're very long, narrow, lightweight, very maneuverable, shallow in the keel. And these were mostly made of oak. There's a few examples made from pine. They would be up to 15 by 90 feet in dimensions. I think this one is about 70 feet long. They would hold a maximum crew of 50. And here in this, on the right, you see a painting of how the sails would be attached. These would be wool or linen sails. And here's some of the crew with their shields and their oars. So they can operate either by sail power or by virtue of their oars. And actually, although this one is quite long, many of the Viking ships were more like this one. This is an image of a long ship on a rune stone. And you can see the characteristic sail. And it's actually relatively short and a little bit deeper draft. And this would have been used more for transporting cargo. So a variety of ships, all in the same basic style. And I have to point out, this is fascinating for modern audiences. The Vikings sailed extensively. They had no compass. They had no clock. They navigated with the sun and the stars in ways that are still unknown to us. Very often when they would follow along the coastlines, they would observe the clouds, the flights of birds, patterns in the waves to get some kind of orientation in relation to the land and the direction in which they were going. Here's a map of the Viking migrations. Those of you who have the handout may have this in front of you. And you can see their extensive voyages on their long ships, and it begs the question, why? What were they trying to accomplish? Not just looting and pillaging. A variety of motivations drove the Vikings to leave their original homeland and travel across on the great oceans of the Western world. Well, as I said, most of them were agriculturalists. They might be seeking better land or more land. The land in Scandinavia is not the greatest for growing crops. We also experienced at the time of the Vikings a kind of a political consolidation as various chiefs among the Viking peoples would be trying to gain power. They would often use as a mechanism for gaining power the ability to provide riches to their followers, enhance their status, And so they would often go out on raids to acquire territory, to acquire loot, to enhance their reputation. Ambitious warriors might strike out on their own, not part of an organized group. And of course, the technology of shipbuilding made all this travel possible. A lot of Vikings also engaged in trade missions, commerce, settling colonies as commercial outposts around Western Europe and even into the Eastern Mediterranean. So we'll be talking about those a bit more later as well. So again, a variety of motivations for the Viking explorations and settlements. Now, we can't deny, I'm not trying to paint an overly rosy picture or kind of a kumbaya picture of the Vikings. You wouldn't necessarily want some Vikings to show up here on the campus of Willow Valley back in the 9th century, 10th century. They were formidable fighters, capable of great mayhem. The word berserk appeared in the Middle Ages, means bare skin or bare shirt. So we're not sure if they wore bare skins when they fought, but they were quite handy with the battle axe here and the sword. They might have worn a chain mail shirt. Here's a conical cap, an artifact, and you can see there are no horns on it. These would typically be made of leather. If you were a successful chief, you might have one made out of iron. These are reconstructed Viking shields, round shields made primarily of wood. The first well-documented Viking raid on England was in the year 793 at Lindisfarne, a monastic center in northern England. And a contemporary chronicler wrote about this attack. Here it's rather luridly portrayed in this much later painting, but the account of this attack reads as follows: "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race, nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made. Behold the church of St. Cuthbert, spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments. A place more venerable than all in Britain is given as prey to pagan peoples." Well, yes, they were pagans, but they had nothing particularly against Christianity. They were not anti-Christian. They just wanted to go to churches and monasteries because that's where the stuff was, valuable stores of gold, silver, silk, jewels, things useful for trading purposes. And although they certainly killed enough members of religious communities, they often seized manuscripts or human hostages and sold them back for ransom. There's a story in the early 10th century. A king of England paid 40 pounds to have a captured bishop freed from Viking hands, but the Archbishop of Canterbury was not so lucky. In the year 1011, he refused to arrange for a ransom when he was captured. His captors, Viking warriors, got drunk, pelted him with bones and ox heads, finally put him out of his misery with an axe blow to the head. So thus, the Archbishop of Canterbury met his demise at the hands of the Vikings. Here's a map showing where Lindisfarne is up in northern England. Again, that initial attack in 793. In the 800s, a Viking army ranged across northern England, led by a colorfully named Viking chief called Ivar the Boneless. We're not sure quite what that means. They deposed, killed Anglo-Saxon kings in northern England. They captured the city of York, which became then a center of an independent Viking kingdom for a number of years. Down here is the ancient kingdom of Wessex. This was the only Anglo-Saxon holdout against the Vikings to the north, and they drew this boundary between them, separating Wessex from what was called the Danelaw, the area where Danish or Viking law and authority held sway. Viking rule in northern England continued until the early 900s. Then they were ousted from northern England. England was united briefly, but the Vikings came back. In the 1000s, Viking force led by another colorfully named leader, Sven Forkbeard, invaded, and all England submitted to the rule of the Vikings. Then Canute appears on the scene. The son of Sven Forkbeard takes the English throne as Canute the Great. And there he is portrayed in a later medieval illustration. So we have a period of Viking control, ebbing and rising on the island of England, Britain. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Vikings were not always fighting, looting, and pillaging. They established a number of settlements, walled settlements for trading purposes, where they would produce craft goods for sale on the open market. These were typically located on seacoasts. Many of them became centers of commerce in the Baltic region. This is a fascinating and quite large reconstruction of one of these Viking settlements, the town of Birka. And you can see the various homes and workshops, wooden sidewalks leading down to the pier, a number of Viking vessels docked. And again, these are the shorter ones used for commercial purposes. Here's another view out into the harbor from this diorama. You can see the ship being loaded with trade goods. So these commercial centers were funded by tariffs or taxes on trade activity taking place. The local chieftains would have some revenue from this source, and in return they would provide protection to the Viking merchants and outsiders who would come to these locations for trade purposes. Many of these cities were abandoned as the rising land, especially in Denmark and southern Sweden, isolates them. What's happening during the Viking era is the glaciers, of course, have long retreated, and the land in that part of the world is slowly rising, kind of a rebound from all this weight of the glaciers. And as the land rebounds, the sea obviously goes further and further away. So most of these Viking trading settlements, in fact, are a few miles inland, which makes it, of course, easier for archaeologists to dig up the remains. Here are some examples of the craft production, the trade goods that would be produced in Viking settlements. Notice none of these represent what we would call fine art. All art, so to speak, in the Viking world was decorative art, applied to functional objects, wearable objects, made of iron, wood, bone, leather, amber. Here's a wonderful example of a silver pendant. It'd be worn on a chain around the neck. The Vikings loved glass beads, colorful glass beads. They would import raw glass, mostly from Eastern Mediterranean, melt it down into the shape of beads and refashion them into necklaces, other decorative items. Here is an ornamental gold brooch. And amazing, how would you like to wear this on your toga or your tunic? With finely filigreed gold, and has patterns of intertwined, sort of fantastic animal shapes, vegetation, just pure ornamentation, very characteristic of Viking artisanal production. Down at the bottom is a comb made out of a deer's antler. This is evidence, along with the presence of mirrors and wash basins in Viking hordes, that the Vikings actually cared a lot about hygiene and personal appearances. They cut their hair, they trimmed their beards, they took a bath once a week, perhaps in a kind of a sauna. Of course, this is at a time when in Western Europe it was often felt that if you took a bath once in your lifetime, that was perhaps one too many. There's a later poem in the sagas refers to a guest being met by his host at the table with water, a towel, and a hearty welcome. Viking trade and other contacts extended widely across the Western world, sort of international contacts in the sense, although nations as we know them today did not exist. Here's a fascinating example. For those of you who have been to Istanbul, to the great Hagia Sophia Church, you know, if you go up in the gallery, you can see on this railing an inscription carved by some bored Viking mercenaries in the 9th century as they're whiling away their hours. An amazing artifact preserved in that great church, now sadly has reverted to a mosque. So what are Vikings doing in Istanbul, or as it was known then, Constantinople? The Byzantine emperor recruited a bodyguard, an elite unit of Vikings. They were known as the Varangian Guard. Their commander was a fellow by the name of Harald Hardrada, who goes on to become the King of Norway, later unsuccessfully tries to seize the crown of England. Some of you may know the story of the Battle of Hastings. Well, before Harold Godwinson fought the Battle of Hastings, he fought a battle in northern England against Harald Hardrada, formerly of Constantinople or Istanbul. Here's another example of some international commerce. These are probably coins minted in Baghdad, huge hordes of Arab coins. 90,000 in total have been discovered in burial sites in the Viking world. What are they doing in the ground? Well, they didn't have banks, obviously. These coins were probably buried for safekeeping. They might have represented the wealth of a family. And after they were buried, the family, for whatever reason, was never able to return. Interestingly, although these were used in the Arab world as coins with a certain specie value, when they were acquired by the Vikings in trade, they were not used as currency. They were just traded by weight, very often melted down to make jewelry and other precious objects. And I have to show you this. We spotted this in a museum in Sweden. This is a Buddha, a jade figurine from India, about a little over 3 inches high. It's amazing. How did this end up in a grave, a Viking grave in Sweden? A fascinating story to which we just don't know the answer. Let me talk a little bit about Viking society. 3 groups in society for classification purposes. Sharp distinctions and social hierarchy, as in many early societies. The lowest class, of course, were the thralls. The word thrall now is a term used to describe servitude. We say someone is in thrall to a particular idea or passion. So that's in fact the source of the word thrall in modern English usage. Thralls were slaves, a very valuable commodity, very important commodity in the Viking world. And this picture depicts, so we're now in Russia. These are Vikings living in Russia, and they are selling a slave in this market setting to some Muslims, probably Khazars from Central Asia, who have shown up not for military confrontation, but for trading purposes. One of the other important Viking trade centers was Dublin, Ireland, in fact. And some of you may know a little bit about the Irish slave trade because St. Patrick had earlier been a victim of slavers, pirates, operating out of Ireland generally. Here is the great Viking middle class, the Carls, or freemen, mostly farmers. Here you have at a reconstructed village in Sweden, toiling away. They don't look at all like horned, axe-wielding warriors tending to their herb garden. Here's a typical hovel or modest home of one of these carls with a sod roof, wooden construction. Very nice fence there. And here's the cozy interior of a carl's home. Nice bearskin rugs or some sort of animal fur. Very nice, very comfortable place to hang out during the winters of northern Europe. Now, if you were a Jarl, you were a member of the Viking elite. These would be the chiefs or nobles who would follow a chief into battle. Very stylish attire. There's one of those brooches. Very nicely dressed, very well groomed. This is a fashion designer had attempted to replicate based on fabric samples and other artifacts, other evidence what a Viking might really have looked like. Here's his home on the left. Again, very nice. He's got a tapestry on the wall. This would have been a very high value, high status decorative item. Over here is a nice iron helmet, eating utensils. And down at the bottom is a rune illustration of two Jarls playing a board game. And these games were very important not only to pass the time during the long northern winters, but also these games would often be associated with military strategy and tactics. All right, still good? All right, sorry for that brief interruption. Women in the Viking world had more equality or near equality with men than in the Christian West at the time. Women managed the home while their men were often away on trading missions or off a Viking raiding coastal settlements. These are keys recovered from a grave site that would be held by the women as a symbol of their authority. Women could very often acquire wealth. They could inherit property. Women frequently paid for public rune stones to memorialize their fathers or husbands. This shows a very high status burial of a Viking woman. These are actual artifacts discovered, and they've been converted into the form of a painting so we can see it perhaps as it was when she was laid into the ground. Lots of nice stuff here. This is a bronze bowl from Ireland. This is a flask from what is now present-day France or the Low Countries. This is a linen press made out of whalebone. And of course, elsewhere you see these brightly colored fabrics, very important part of what you need to take with you when you're buried, if you have the wealth to obtain those objects, so you have them to accompany you in the afterlife. Very interesting recent excavation in Birka, the city of Birka. I showed you the settlement earlier. Excavation of a grave there had uncovered weapons, horses, a game board, which, as I said, would be associated with military tactics, and a recent DNA analysis has shown the human remains there to be those of a woman. So for the first time, we have evidence of a high-ranking female Viking warrior. A very interesting addition to our knowledge of the Viking world. This is a characteristic dwelling of a Viking family, a longhouse, a reconstruction at a site in Denmark. You can see it's made of wood, timber frame, and the roof would be covered with sod, or in this case, wooden shingles. These would be up to about 20 by 60 feet in dimensions, and during the winter, the animals would shelter in there as well as the human inhabitants. You can see inside this reconstruction the wooden benches on either side of the hearth. And here, of course, is our intrepid tour guide. He has given up his ceremonial throne for one of our fellow senior citizen participants in the tour. You can imagine it's quite dark. There are no windows here. It's quite dark, smoky inside when the fires are going. But there would be a small hole in the top, or as in this case, on the gable ends here, so the smoke could escape naturally. And the Old Norse, the Old Viking word for these holes was wind-eye, E-Y-E, from which we get the cognate term window later on in English. As Viking kingdoms would coalesce, we see the rise of forts and fortifications as collective effort is applied in the management and defense of what becomes small states, if you will, mini-states in the Viking world. Here's an example of a defensive fortification in Denmark. It's called the Danevirke, an 18-mile defensive wall. And if you think of the geography of Denmark, you know it's quite narrow where it connects with present-day Germany. And in fact, this wall was built around 700 AD to protect the Vikings from the Saxons to the south, present-day Germany. It was originally much higher. This is the stone portion. It was originally 30 feet tall, would have been topped with oak timbers to create kind of a palisade across the top. This wall was actually, as recently as World War II, was refortified, reinforced by the Germans to ward off a potential Allied invasion from the north coming down through Denmark. Here's a fascinating remains of a fort, a Trelleborg, a circle fort. Here you can see part of the ramparts surrounding the space inside, which has been excavated to some degree. These stones mark off one of the barracks buildings, which are reproduced in this model, which appears at the museum site. This was built in the 10th century either for defensive purposes. It may have been a royal administrative center, about 500 residents. And again, these are the barracks inside the circular wall for the military and official residents of the town. And outside are more barracks buildings which presumably housed families, women and children. Their remains were actually discovered on site. So we know that as in the American Army today, for example, places like Germany, often soldiers are accompanied by their families, and that was the case here. By the way, this fort, and this is just one of many in the Viking world, this fort to build required about 8,000 fully grown oak trees, which perhaps explains why there aren't very many forests left today in Denmark. A little bit about Viking folk religion. No uniform rituals, no priesthood. The Viking term for religion is simply a word that means the ancient customs. Worship would be led by chiefs or heads of families. We don't have any contemporary description of Viking religion. We know only from the Icelandic sagas what the basic belief system was, at least among the elite. And it centers around this notion of Yggdrasil. This is a kind of a drawing, contemporary drawing to illustrate the cosmology of the Viking believers. So Yggdrasil is this great ash tree here which holds the universe together. At its base is Asgard, the abode of the gods. Up above in the heavens, here's the sun on a chariot being chased by a wolf. Here's the moon, another chariot being chased. Various animal figures in the leaves. The human world is Middle Earth, which I think is where Tolkien got his term Middle Earth. This is where we live, this little patch right in here. It has a wall around it, surrounded by an ocean. And a great serpent here, here's his head, a great serpent in the ocean, other monsters in this region outside of Middle Earth. And down below is a place called Hell, which is a cognate of the English term hell, the realm of the dead, where other monsters lurk. This whole system, by the way, will come to an end during a great battle called Ragnarok, the battle of the gods, destroying the world. A huge flood will ensue, and afterwards the world will be repopulated by two human survivors. So just as in the Old Testament, in ancient Mesopotamian legend, this notion of a great destructive flood also lingered in the minds of the Vikings. You may know some figures from Viking religion. When I was a kid, mythology, Greek, Roman, and Norse, as it was called, Norse mythology, always a popular topic in school discussions. Here's Odin, the greatest of the gods, god of war, the god of death, wisdom. His wife, Frigg, was the goddess of marriage and motherhood. Odin, by the way, gave his name to the day of the week, Wednesday, Odin's Day. His wife, Frigg, or possibly another woman named Freya, the goddess of love and beauty, gave us the name Friday. Tuesday is named after the son of Odin by the name of Tyr. And Thursday, of course, is Thor's day. Thor was the god of storms with his magic hammer, often a very popular amulet worn by Vikings. And here he is about to dispatch one of his enemies here by whacking him on the head with his magic hammer. Some other characters from Viking mythology. Dwarves served as craftsmen. They lived underground and carried out metalwork, smithing in those mysterious lower regions. And here is a Valkyrie. You may remember her. I showed her during my talk on the history of beer a few weeks ago. Not at all like the Wagnerian depiction of a Valkyrie. These were holy women who would take fallen warriors to Valhalla, the great hall, to rest and train if they fell in battle. They would train up for participation in Ragnarok, that great battle to take place at some future point. You'll notice she's holding a beer stein made out of a deer's horn, very appropriate to Viking culture. And some of you may remember the Viking saying about beer, which I told you a couple of weeks ago. I quote, "Beer is not so good for me as it is said to be. The more a man drinks, the less control he has of his thoughts. Be most careful with beer and another man's wife." Sound advice. Well, Viking beliefs are reflected in these burial sites to some degree. Now, a lot of Vikings were cremated, but if you were of a high enough status, you would have a fabulous tomb burial location. And in that tomb would be a ship to transport you to the next world. This is a marvelous reconstruction of a Viking burial site in Ladbu in Denmark. And what they've done, so this was the original mound. They excavated it and found at the bottom the remains of a burial ship here. And then instead of piling all the dirt back on, they erected a dome over it, just put some sod on top, so it looks the same from the outside, but when you walk in, it's as though you were walking sort of like Superman, able to walk through things and observe this burial site. Fascinating, and what it contained, in addition to a great chief and all his possessions, included 4 dogs and 11 horses. Here's a painting on the site, actually a diorama which lays out the positions in which the animal remains were found on this ship. Here's another popular burial custom. Usually it was too expensive to bury a Viking in an actual ship, so you would erect stones in the shape of a ship to give him a proper send-off, just on the surface here. And this is from a site in Denmark. Here's a site in Sweden. This is the site, by the way. I'm standing on top of the mound that I showed you earlier, where I was standing by the runestone. So here are two ships. They're called ship settings. You can see there's some picnickers wandering about to give you a sense of scale. And this rock in the middle would represent the mast of the ship. This is by far the largest stone settings. Each of these is more than 50 feet long. And the stones had fallen down over time, were re-erected early in the 20th century. Well, ultimately, the Viking world becomes part of the Christian world. Through trade contacts, through missionaries from England and Germany, kings would convert in order to take control of religion from local chiefs and to bolster their authority. They could now claim, I am anointed by God, a much more important figure than any of you mere mortals. Harald Bluetooth was the first. He was a king of Denmark, introduced Christianity into the Viking world, and his conversion is commemorated on this rune stone in Jelling in Denmark, erected in the year 980. And what it says here, according to the translation, King Harald ordered this monument to be made in honor of Gorm, his father, and in memory of Tyr, his mother. Harald, who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. And on the back side of this monument, this is a copy. It's been painted as it would have been originally, brightly colored. It shows Christ, and he's intertwined with characteristic decorative shapes of Viking art. By the way, I want to make a comment about Harald Bluetooth. His teeth were not blue. The word is a translation from black chieftain. He was evidently dark complected. His mother may have been Slavic. And I also have to show you the Bluetooth logo to explain the connection between Bluetooth wireless technology and King Harald, who made the Danes Christian. The Bluetooth technology was invented in Lund, Sweden, which happened to be the administrative capital of Harald Bluetooth. So he's quite a local celebrity, and his name was attached to that technology. And the logo of Bluetooth is actually the runic symbol for Harald Bluetooth. Some other interesting examples of Christian influence in the Viking world. Here is King Canute again, depicted as a pious Christian with his wife. Canute was actually the grandson of Harald Bluetooth, took the throne of England in 1015, endowed churches, monasteries, and in 1028, Canute defeated this man. This is Olaf of Norway, King of Norway, who also is alleged to have introduced the Norwegian people to Christianity, now honored as a saint. And you can see in this statue, wooden statue from around 1300, Saint Olaf is carrying a Viking battle axe. I don't think we'll find, if we went to the Vatican, I don't think we would find any saints carrying battle axes. Here's some other interesting Christian evidence. Here's a small silver crucifix with an image of Christ, and he's wearing trousers, much as any Viking jarl would wear. And this is a fascinating close-up of a rune stone. It shows one figure holding a cross, a Christian cross, seems to be entering some sort of a doorway. And on the back of this rune stone it says, Nicholas, which is a Christian name, Nicholas has this stone erected in memory of Sisa, his father. So here is Sisa, or here's Nicholas, perhaps here is Sisa, and maybe the son has created an image of his father entering the kingdom of heaven upon his death. Viking architecture also reflects the blending of Christian and pagan influences. This is a reconstruction. It happens to be a plexiglass sheet at this site which draws, if you will, on the landscape what it would look like in the time when this church actually existed. Here you have the dragons on the peaks, typical Viking symbology on a Christian church. And this church happened to be erected on the site of a long-time pagan temple. Here is the crypt in Lund Cathedral, built in the 12th century, and holding up the columns in the base is a troll, a Viking troll. Again, another example of how Viking symbology was introduced into Christian architecture. And a final example here from the famous Stave Church in Ornes, Norway, characteristic Northern European architectural style. And if you went around to the front, to the door, you would see this wooden carving showing snakes and dragons. Again, a very pagan Viking kind of symbolism on this church. Well, in their heyday, Viking territory expanded widely. The Vikings entered what is now Russian territory for trade along the river systems, and the legend goes in 862, the Vikings were invited to become the rulers of the Slavs of that part of the world. These Vikings became known as the Rus, which gave its name to Russia. Here is the first Viking to land, a Viking chieftain by the name of Rurik. These are the Russians with their furs and long caftans. So a trading mission initially developed into political domination of the Slavic peoples by Viking immigrants. And those Vikings, by the way, established a dynasty that lasted until 1598. In Normandy, northern France, also very important to the Vikings. Initially, the Vikings were bribed to stay out of the realm of the Frankish king, but eventually they agreed to an alliance. These Vikings in northern France were baptized, given land, given fiefs, and integrated into the political scene. And by 1066, these Vikings were Frenchified Normans or Northmen, and then proceeded to cross the English Channel. This is from the Bayeux Tapestry, and finally conquer England. So although earlier in English history, the Viking presence was intermittent, from 1066, the descendants of the Vikings take control of England. Viking adventurers also headed into the Mediterranean, went around, followed the coast of France and Spain, entered the Mediterranean, ended up in Italy of all places. This happens to be in Melfi in southern Italy. This is a Norman or Viking castle. Vikings, or Normans as they were known, also founded a very prosperous kingdom in Sicily in southern Italy, which ruled for about 100 years in the 12th century. Vikings went further afield. They founded a colony in Iceland and established in the year 930, so it is said, they established the Althing, an annual meeting of all the free men of the island. This Althing continues as the oldest parliament in Europe. Now, one particular Icelandic adventurer by the name of Eric the Red committed manslaughter. He was banished from the island, travels west, settles in Greenland. Greenland was actually warmer than Iceland at the time, warmer than Greenland is today, and was given the name Greenland as sort of a marketing gimmick to attract settlers. Greenland was also a very important source of walrus ivory exported to Europe for ecclesiastical items. This is a particular trade. Vikings had a monopoly on ivory trade, walrus ivory. The picture shows a church in Valsey, Greenland. This church was established probably in the 1200s But the Vikings never went native in Greenland. I said in Normandy they did go native. They became part of the Norman political establishment, the French political establishment. But in Greenland they were always outsiders, very much a small population. And in the 1400s, the late 1400s, this Viking presence in Greenland ended. We don't know where the Vikings went, what happened to them. Perhaps they were victims of a trend towards colder weather in Greenland. Maybe the Black Death reached to Greenland. And so the Viking monopoly on the walrus trade ended, and Europeans began getting their ivory from African elephants. Kind of a change in the geopolitical scene and the international marketplace in the height of the Middle Ages. Well, Eric the Red had a son named Leif Erikson, who is credited with discovering North America. In around 980, and for a period of a couple of decades after that, Leif Erikson had a settlement in Newfoundland, in Canada. Here's a painting of his landfall. This is in the US Capitol. And this is the site where he made landfall, established a settlement at a place known as Lonzo Meadows in Newfoundland. This is the only site in North America that has been positively identified with the Vikings. And on the site is a reconstruction of a log house, that characteristic fence again. And Leif Erikson made in his account, referred to a place called Vinland, a place of wild grapes. And we're not sure if by Vinland he meant this location or maybe a place further south, maybe towards territory of the United States. Although the only architectural evidence we have that the Vikings ever got down to American territory is a coin from the 11th century found at a Native American site in Maine. And again, it may have just ended up there as an item of trade, not necessarily a sign that Vikings had traveled that far south. But a very fascinating and tantalizingly brief Viking presence in North America. Well, in the 18th and 19th centuries, as the Viking world is being rediscovered through archaeology and other scientific studies, an idea of romanticism, nationalism attaches itself to Viking peoples, and the Viking myths were put to heroic uses. As in this depiction, I mentioned Richard Wagner. This is a staging from the 1930s of the Metropolitan Opera, Kirsten Flagstad as a Valkyrie. And you have to admit, she doesn't look at all like the woman holding that beer stein I showed you earlier. And she has kind of horns and wings on her helmet, very ahistorical. Here's a menacing application of Viking ethos. This is a recruiting poster in Norway during the Nazi occupation. The Nazis attempted to recruit members into an SS unit, exploiting the Viking mythology to suggest that perhaps you too can emulate your ancestors in this quest of world conquest. Here's a lighter touch, Hagar the Horrible, iconic symbol of Viking culture in the popular mind. And of course, we have to mention the Minnesota Vikings logo with a very pronounced application of horns there. And if any of you have traveled on Viking river cruises, well, the very name Viking, and their logo is a Viking ship with all the features, the striped sail, the exaggerated prow, with the ornamentation there. So everywhere we look, it seems, the Vikings are still speaking to us. And now, if you would like to find your inner Viking, you might want to go to the Shetland Islands off the coast of Scotland, where every year the Christmas season is marked by a festival called Up Helly Ah, a fire festival started in the late 19th century, and it pays tribute to the Viking custom of burning ships. Their very highest leaders, the ships would not buried but burned. And you'll see this is a short news clip, and you'll have to pay close attention to the English dialect is bad enough, but when the Scotsman begins speaking, you may have a hard time understanding what he's saying, but let me explain. You'll see a procession of reenactors called geysers. They constitute a Jarl squad, a squad of freemen, warriors, and they are in Lerwick, the main town in the Shetland Islands. And you'll note that after they celebrate and burn the ship and consume vast quantities of alcohol, they parade through the streets. They visit schools and retirement homes, entertaining the locals with this suggestion of Viking culture. So again, watch the accent here and enjoy this very brief news report of some present-day Vikings.
Fire on the streets of Lerwick. Over 900 costumed geysers marched through the town at the start of a long night of entertainment and merrymaking. At the heart of Uphellia is a band of around 70 latter-day Vikings called the Jarl Squad. They're led by this man, Geyser Jarl Lyle Gare, who's a builder by trade, but clearly a Viking at heart. All day, the Jarl Squad has been marching through the town, visiting schools and care centres and attending civic events. But tonight it's been joined by hundreds more geysers to escort a replica Viking galley to a park in the heart of town, where it's ceremonially burned amid cheers, songs and proclamations. It's an emotional time for the Geyser Jarl, who spent the last 15 years preparing for this moment.
It's absolutely amazing. And you can see it's raining at the moment and the galley's on fire. That's all that matters. It's truly a unique event. Only a limited few ever see this moment, and I'm delighted to be one of them.
Even as the galley still burns, the geysers disperse in groups to the halls and venues around the town, where they'll spend the rest of the night performing acts that can be musical, satirical or just plain mad. Many of these people won't get to sleep until well past dawn. Mike Grundon, reporting Scotland in Shetland.
Well, let's hear it for the Vikings. Vikings of the Shetland Islands, and may they prosper and continue to consume vast quantities of alcohol and perform good deeds of public service for the inhabitants of the Shetland Islands. I'm going to check now and see if we have any questions that have come in over the transom.
Yes.
We have a question.
It's actually more of a comment. Viking religion as ancient wisdom and the pictorial description of the world seems very much like Sanatan Dharma of Hindus. Hinduism is not considered as a religion, but a forever way of living.
Very, very good observation. Yes, it's the notion of a religion as an institution is not necessarily universal, and certainly examples of that was Hinduism. It's more of a way of life. And to the Vikings, I think it falls somewhere between a way of life and just a view of the world and these gods and demons and spiritual beings that populate the world. And again, I have to make one final caveat to that point. What we saw in that depiction of the Yggdrasil, the cosmology of the Vikings, is really reconstructed by a present-day interpreter based on a lot of source material. And unlike the Hindu world, we don't know what the ordinary Vikings believed. What we have are these accounts passed on among the elite through the oral traditions of the Icelandic sagas. So, but a good point, well made, and I hope you learned perhaps more than you ever expected you would about Viking religion and about the Vikings themselves. So let's move on to next week's program. We're going to start a two-part series on Western Turkey, which I call the crossroads of civilization. You may not know much about Turkey. You may not even know why the bird that we eat at Thanksgiving is called the turkey. I'll explain that to you by and by. But just a fascinating array of cultural events of great importance, historical events in this area of Western Turkey. Very important not only to Islam as it is today, and there you see the Hagia Sophia Mosque in the background, but important to Christianity as well, very important center of the Christian world. St. Paul established more churches in Turkey than anywhere else. You see at the top right a Greco-Roman gymnasium in Western Turkey. We'll also talk about the Hittites. We'll talk about King Croesus. We'll talk about Ephesus. We'll talk about the great underground cities of Cappadocia. Just a lot of things going on in Western Turkey. And we'll bring it up to the present day too, because when I visited Western Turkey, I had occasion to witness almost firsthand the Taksim Square riots of 2013. So a lot in store for us over the next 2 weeks, and I hope you'll be joining me again next week for part 1 of Western Turkey, Crossroads of Civilization.